The dampness of the English morning felt like it had teeth, biting through the heavy sheepskin of my B-3 flight jacket. It was 4 o'clock in the morning at Thorpe Abbott's, and the world was reduced to the yellowed halos of flashlights and the rhythmic crunch of gravel under heavy combat boots. We walked in silence, a procession of shadows toward the briefing shack. No one joked, no one whistled. The air was too thick with the unsaid. Inside, the room was a haze of blue tobacco smoke that swirled around the rafters. 200 men sat on hard wooden benches, their faces etched with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. At the front of the room stood a large easel, covered by a simple piece of plywood. That plywood was the only thing standing between us and our fate. When Colonel Thompson stepped up to the platform, the room went vacuum still. He didn't waste time with a preamble. He reached out and slid the plywood aside. A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. It was the sound of 60 crews realizing they were looking at their own headstones. The red yarn on the map started at our base in East Anglia, crossed the English Channel, cut through the heart of occupied France, and plunged deep, too deep, into the black gut of Germany. It ended at a small, circled dot in Bavaria. "Schweinfurt," the colonel said. His voice was as dry as bone. "The heart of the Third Reich's ball-bearing industry. You destroy those plants, and you stop the wheels of the entire Wehrmacht. No bearings, no tanks. No bearings, no Messerschmitts." I looked at the map again. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. I was lead pilot of Heavenly Maiden, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, and I knew the math as well as any man in that room. The red line was too long. Our escort, the P-47 Thunderbolts, only had enough internal fuel to take us just past the German border. After that, they would have to turn back. "Intelligence suggests the Luftwaffe will throw everything they have at us once the little friends depart," Thompson continued, his eyes scanning the room. "You will be flying in a combat box formation at 25,000 feet. You must maintain that stagger. If you fall out of the box, you are dead. If you lag behind, you are dead." I glanced at my navigator Miller. He was staring at his flight deck, his fingers trembling ever so slightly as he calculated the fuel. We would be over enemy territory without protection for over 3 hours. 3 hours of being hunted by the finest interceptors in the world. "The wind at altitude is 60 miles per hour from the northwest," the weather officer barked, stepping up. "Temperature is 40 degrees below zero. Watch for frostbite. If you touch bare metal up there, you'll lose the skin." 40 degrees below zero. It was a strange thought, that we were going to a place where the very air was a poison that could freeze a man's lungs just so we could drop 55,000 pounds of high explosives on a factory. We stood for the chaplain's prayer. I wasn't a religious man, not usually, but as the words, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," echoed against the corrugated tin roof, I found myself gripping my dog tags until the metal edges cut into my palm. We filed out into the dark. The trucks were waiting to take us to the hard stands where the fortresses sat, silent and silver in the mist. As I climbed into the back of the deuce-and-a-half truck, I looked at the faces of my crew. Most were boys, 19, 20 years old, with smooth skin and eyes that had seen too much of the North Sea. "Captain?" It was Zeke, my tail gunner. He was a farm boy from Iowa who could hit a moving mark at 1,000 yards. "Yeah, Zeke? Do you think the Germans know we're coming?" I looked toward the eastern horizon, where the faintest sliver of gray was beginning to bleed into the black. "Zeke," I said softly, "by the time we hit the coast, the whole world is going to know we're coming." I hopped off the truck and stood before the Heavenly Maiden. Her nose art, a blonde girl in a flowing white dress sitting on a cloud, looked back at me with a painted smile. I put my hand on her cold aluminum flank. She felt solid. She felt like a fortress. But I knew that at 25,000 feet, she was nothing more than a thin-skinned bird of glass and wire, and the sky today was going to be full of hawks. The silence of the English countryside was shattered by the simultaneous cough and roar of 1,200 Wright Cyclone engines. I sat in the left seat of the cockpit, my hands moving through the rhythmic dance of the pre-flight checklist. Toggle switches clicked, needles on a dozen dials flickered to life, and the air inside the cabin began to vibrate with a violent mechanical energy. Beside me, my co-pilot, Billy Tex Henderson, was shouting numbers over the intercom, his voice a tinny rasp in my earphones. "Number 1's clear. Number 2's hot. Manifold pressure looks steady, Captain." I eased the throttles forward. The Heavenly Maiden groaned, her 65,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and high-explosive ordnance straining against the brakes. We were part of a massive, lumbering serpent of silver wings, taxiing nose to tail down the perimeter track. One by one, the fortresses at the head of the line roared down the runway, disappearing into the low-hanging scud of the morning overcast. When our turn came, the world narrowed to the strip of oil-stained concrete ahead of us. I jammed the throttles to the firewalls. The noise was no longer a sound. It was a physical weight that pressed us back into our seats. The tail lifted, the vibration smoothed out, and suddenly, the earth let go. We punched through the gray ceiling of the fog and emerged into a world of blinding crystalline blue. Below us, the clouds looked like a frozen white ocean. Above, the sky was a deep, bruised indigo. We spent the next hour spiraling upward, joining the massive assembly of the 1st Bombardment Wing. It was a sight of terrifying beauty. Nearly 300 B-17 bombers, arranged in stacked combat boxes, catching the morning sun like a school of prehistoric fish. "Little friends at 10 o'clock high," Miller the navigator called out. I looked up and felt a surge of genuine warmth, despite the creeping chill of the cabin. A squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts was diving down to meet us. They were stubby, powerful-looking machines, and they wove back and forth above our formation like sheepdogs guarding a flock. With them around, the sky felt a little less empty. We crossed the coast of occupied Europe at 24,000 feet. Below, the patchwork fields of Belgium were visible through gaps in the clouds. It looked peaceful from 4 miles up, but we knew better. To our left, the first black puffs of flak began to bloom, the German greeting. They looked like dirty cotton balls, harmless until you heard the whoomp, whoomp of the concussion and felt the Heavenly Maiden shudder as if a giant had kicked her in the belly. I checked my watch. We had been in the air for nearly 3 hours. I looked out the side window at the Thunderbolt on our left wing. The pilot was close enough that I could see the yellow goggles over his eyes. He raised a gloved hand in a crisp, somber salute. Then he dipped his wing, and his squadron began a wide, sweeping turn back toward the west. "There they go," Tex whispered into the throat mic. The radio silence was broken by a chorus of clicks as the fighter pilots signed off. They were at the limit of their fuel. They were heading back to the safety of England, to warm barracks and hot coffee. We were staying. Suddenly, the sky ahead of us felt impossibly vast and hostile. Without the little friends, the Heavenly Maiden felt less like a fortress and more like a target. "All gunners, test your weapons," I commanded. "Short bursts only. We have a long way to go." The aircraft shook as 10 50 caliber machine guns barked in unison. The smell of cordite drifted into the cockpit, a sharp, acrid scent that signaled the end of the journey and the beginning of the fight. We were 60 miles past the border, deep inside the German air defense zone. "Bogies, 12 o'clock high, coming out of the sun," the nose gunner screamed. I squinted against the glare. At first, they were just tiny black specks, no larger than gnats. But they were growing with terrifying speed. 2 specks. 10. 20. 50. They weren't circling or maneuvering. They were coming straight at us in a head-on suicide charge, their wings flickering with the yellow sparks of 20mm cannons. "Here we go," I muttered, bracing my feet against the rudder pedals. "Hold the formation! Don't let the box break!" The air around us erupted. A B-17 in the lead element, the Piccadilly lily suddenly blossomed into a ball of orange flame. One moment it was a majestic flying machine, the next it was a rain of scorched aluminum and tattered parachutes. The massacre had begun. The transition from a high-altitude ferry flight to a death struggle happened in the space of a single heartbeat. One moment the sky was an empty, infinite blue. The next, it was streaked with the white scars of condensation trails and the oily black smoke of burning engines. The German pilots weren't playing by the old rules today. They didn't hang on our flanks or try to pick us off from the rear where our Browning machine guns were thickest. They came from the front. 12 o'clock high, the company front tactic. "Frontal attack! 2 o'clock! Level!" Tex screamed, his voice cracking with the sheer volume of his terror. I saw them then. A wall of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, wings level, closing the distance at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour. It was a game of chicken played with steel and high explosives. The yellow noses of the German planes flickered with a rhythmic, lethal light. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy 20mm shells slammed into the Heavenly Maiden's nose. The plexiglass greenhouse where Miller sat shattered with a sound like 1,000 crystal chandeliers hitting a marble floor. A freezing blast of -40-degree air roared into the cockpit, carrying with it the metallic tang of shredded aluminum and the copper scent of fresh blood. "Miller, talk to me, Miller," I yelled into the interphone. There was no answer, only the hollow, ghostly whistle of the wind through the jagged hole in our ship's face. To our left, the Liberty Belle, a fortress I'd shared a hangar with for 3 months, took a direct hit to her No. 3 engine. The wing didn't just catch fire, it folded upward like a broken fan. I watched, helpless, as the giant bomber rolled lazily onto her back. No parachutes emerged. 6 men were trapped in that spinning coffin, pinned to their seats by centrifugal force as they plummeted 4 miles toward the green, indifferent forests of Westphalia. "Zeke, get those guns barking!" I roared. "I'm on 'em, Cap, I'm on 'em!" The tail gunner's voice was a frantic staccato, punctuated by the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of his twin 50s. The entire airframe vibrated, a shivering beast under the lash of 1,000 tiny hammers. The German tactics were evolving before our eyes. Having shredded the lead element, they began to drop cables with aerial bombs from above, trying to snag our propellers or detonate in the middle of our tight combat box formation. Huge, dirty gray explosions blossomed in the air, tossing our 65,000-pound bomber around like a leaf in a gale. "Captain, we've got a fuel leak on the port side," Tex yelled, pointing at a translucent spray of high-octane gasoline trailing from our wing. If a single tracer hits that... He didn't need to finish the sentence. We were a flying tinderbox. I gripped the control yoke until my flight gloves groaned. The sky was no longer a place for birds. It was a graveyard that moved at 300 miles per hour. We were flying through a debris field of our own making, shards of wings, scorched flight jackets, and the white silk of parachutes that were being systematically strafed by the more ruthless of the German pilots. "Keep her steady, Tex," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "Just keep her in the box. If we lag, we're gone." We were still 90 miles from Schweinfurt, 90 miles of being torn apart, piece by piece, by a Luftwaffe that had finally found the chink in our armor. The self-defending doctrine died that afternoon over the German border, buried under the weight of 200 falling fortresses. The cabin of the Heavenly Maiden had become a wind tunnel of ice and terror. With the nose plexiglass shattered, the sub-zero gale screamed through the fuselage, turning every breath into a plume of white frost. The roar was so absolute it felt like a physical weight, crushing the thoughts right out of my skull. "Miller, status!" I barked again, my thumb jamming the throat mic button. Finally, a choked, wet cough crackled over the interphone. I'm here, Captain. Maps are gone. Everything is... God, it's cold." "Can you see the lead ship?" "Barely. The oil. It's coating what's left of the glass." I glanced out my side window. The No. 2 engine was puking a thick, black sludge that streaked back across the wing, obscuring the view. We were flying blind in a sky that wanted us dead. To our right, another B-17, the Daisy May, was caught in a nightmarish dance. A German Focke-Wulf had rammed her tail assembly, and the two planes were locked together in a jagged embrace of screaming metal, falling toward the earth in a slow, agonizing spiral. "Top turret! 11 o'clock!" Tex screamed. The twin 50s directly above my head opened up, the vibration rattling my teeth so hard I thought they'd crack. The brass shell casings rained down onto the cockpit floor, a metallic hail that clattered against our boots. I watched a Messerschmitt 109 streak past, so close I could see the black cross on its fuselage and the white flicker of the pilot's silk scarf. He wasn't just attacking, he was hunting. "Captain, Zeke's hit!" The voice of the waist gunner, a kid named Sullivan, came through the wire, high-pitched and bordering on hysteria. "The tail! A cannon shell took out the left side! There's blood everywhere, Cap! It's freezing to the floor!" "Sullivan, get back there! Plug him into the oxygen and patch him up," I commanded, trying to keep my voice as steady as an iron bar. "Tex, take the yoke. Keep us tucked under the lead's wing. If we lose the shadow of that big tail, the fighters will swarm us like sharks." "I got it, Cap. I got her," Tex grunted, his muscles straining against the buffeting turbulence of the prop wash. I reached down and felt for the heavy first aid kit, but my fingers were numb, the thick wool of my heated suit failing against the sheer, piercing chill of the slipstream. I looked at the instruments. The manifold pressure on number 2 was dropping. The fuel leak was a steady, shimmering ribbon of death trailing behind us. We were no longer a crew of 10 men. We were a single, bleeding organism trying to stay aloft in a vacuum. I looked ahead. The horizon was smudged with a dark, oily haze. "Is that it?" I whispered. "That's Schweinfurt," Miller's voice came back, sounding small and hollow. "That's the target. 5 minutes to the initial point." The sky ahead was no longer blue. It was a solid wall of black soot, the German flak. The fighters began to peel away, knowing that their own anti-aircraft batteries wouldn't distinguish between a cross and a star. We were heading into a box of fire, carrying 5,000 pounds of demolition bombs, with a dying tail gunner and a wing full of gasoline. "Steady," I told the crew, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "We've come this far. We're going to give them their bearings." As we entered the black clouds of the flak zone, the Heavenly Maiden leaped upward, tossed by a near miss that sent a shard of jagged steel through the floorboards between my feet. The smell of high explosives and burnt grease filled the cockpit. We were at the gates of the furnace. The German interceptors vanished with a suddenness that felt like a physical blow. One moment, the sky was a chaotic tapestry of white contrails and the screaming yellow-nosed shadows of Focke-Wulfs. The next, it was an eerie, hollow vacuum. For a novice pilot, this might have felt like a reprieve, a moment to draw a ragged breath of canned oxygen and wipe the frost from his goggles. But for those of us who had survived the summer over Kiel and Regensburg, this silence was the tolling of a funeral bell. The Luftwaffe fighters were peeling away because they had reached the flak zone. They were stepping back to let the heavy guns on the ground, the 88 and 105 mm monsters, take their turn at dismembering us. "Initial point in 60 seconds, Miller's voice crackled through the interphone. It sounded thin, wheezing, and wet. "Turn to 240 degrees. For the love of God, Captain, hold her steady. Give me a platform, not a roller coaster." I kicked the rudder pedals, banking the Heavenly Maiden into the bomb run. As the wings leveled, the world below us vanished behind a literal wall of black soot. The German gunners at Schweinfurt were not merely firing at us, they were constructing a ceiling of high explosives at 25,000 feet. All around our formation, the sky began to blossom with thousands of oily, jagged carnations of smoke. These weren't the distant puffs of training films. These were close enough that I could hear the whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of the concussions over the roar of our 4 Wright Cyclone engines. Each burst sent a physical shockwave through the aluminum skin of the ship, making the control column buck in my hands like a terrified animal. To my immediate left, the Lulubelle, a fortress piloted by a boy from Nebraska named Miller, no relation to my navigator, was caught in the crosshairs of a battery. I watched, paralyzed, as a direct hit punched through her bomb bay. There was no fire, no slow, dramatic descent. There was only a blinding magnesium-white flash that seared my retinas through my flight goggles. When the spots cleared from my eyes, the 65,000-pound bomber was simply gone. It had been erased from existence. In its place was a sickening rain of scorched aluminum confetti, a few tattered bits of flight suits, and the heavy, tumbling shape of a single engine still spinning its propeller as it fell 4 miles to the earth. 10 men vanished in the space of a heartbeat. "Bomb doors open!" Miller shouted from the greenhouse nose. The Heavenly Maiden let out a mechanical groan, a deep, metallic protest as the great steel maws beneath our feet swung wide. The drag hit us instantly, pulling at the airframe, making the ship wallow and vibrate with a new, violent frequency. We were now a sitting duck. The doctrine of the Norden bombsight demanded a long, straight, and level run. For these few minutes, we were forbidden from taking evasive action. We had to fly directly into the teeth of the furnace, praying that the statistics of war favored our particular serial number. I stared through the shattered remnants of the cockpit window. The wind, at -40 degrees, screamed through the cabin, turning every bead of sweat on my forehead into a stinging grain of ice. Below, through the gaps in the black smoke, I finally saw it. Schweinfurt. The ball-bearing plants looked like gray industrial scars huddled near the bend of the river. From 5 miles up, they seemed so small, so utterly insignificant. It was hard to believe that the fate of the Western world rested on those concrete roofs. If we destroyed those bearings, the German Tiger tanks would grind to a halt in the mud of Russia, and the Messerschmitts would fall from the sky with seized engines. We were here to cut the nerves of the Third Reich. "I've got the hair on the target," Miller whispered. His voice had lost its tremor, replaced by the mechanical, cold rhythm of a man who had retreated into the mathematics of destruction. "Level, level, correcting for drift, 3 degrees left. Hold it, hold it." The seconds stretched into eternities. Every instinct in my body, the primal, lizard brain urge to survive, was screaming at me to dive, to bank, to jerk the yoke and escape the wall of fire. But I kept my eyes locked on the lead ship's belly, my boots hovering over the rudders, my hands clamped onto the wheel until my knuckles went white. A jagged shard of flak, the size of a man's hand, punched through the floorboards between my feet, whistling past my ear and embedding itself in the radio operator's bulkhead with a sound like a meat cleaver hitting a wooden block. The smell of high explosives and burnt grease filled my lungs, thick and suffocating. "Bombs away!" Miller roared. The Heavenly Maiden gave a violent leap upward, suddenly lightened by 5,000 pounds of demolition ordnance. I watched the eggs tumble away in a graceful, lethal curve, trailing toward the smokestacks below. A few seconds later, a series of volcanic eruptions tore through the factory complex. Dust, fire, and debris rose 500 feet into the air. We had hit the heart of the machine. "Direct hits! We leveled the damn place!" Tex cheered beside me, his face split by a manic, terrifying grin. But the triumph was short-lived. A massive flak burst detonated directly beneath our No. 4 engine on the far right wing. The explosion was so violent, it tossed the Heavenly Maiden nearly vertical. The engine cowling disintegrated into 1,000 silver splinters, and a fountain of white-hot fire erupted from the wing. "Feather No. 4! Shut it down! Shut it down!" I roared, wrestling the ship as she tried to roll into a dead man's spiral. The vibration was bone-shaking. The fire was licking back toward the fuel tanks. We had accomplished the mission, but the price of admission was being collected in blood and fire. We were 300 miles from the English coast. We were down to 3 engines. Our tail gunner was bleeding out in the back, and the German fighters, having finished their refueling, were already climbing back up to finish what the guns had started. The Black Thursday was only half over. and the sky was getting darker by the minute. The moment the bombs left our belly, the heavenly maiden surged upward like a bird freed from a cage of iron. But the reprieve lasted only a heartbeat. The flak burst under the No. 4 engine had done more than shred the cowling. It had severed the hydraulic lines and sent a jagged piece of shrapnel through the oil cooler. Through the side window, I watched a terrifying ribbon of black lubricant spray across the silver wing, instantly whipped into a dark froth by the 300-mile-per-hour slipstream. Thick, oily smoke began to pour from the engine, trailing behind us like a funeral shroud. "Feathering No. 4! Cutting the mixture!" Tex screamed, his gloved fingers flying over the pedestal. He slammed the red feathering button, and I watched the runaway propeller slow, its blades turning edge-on to the wind to stop the deadly vibration that threatened to shake the wing right off the spar. The silence from that corner of the ship was deafening. We were now a three-legged beast, struggling to maintain our place in the sky, while the rest of the formation began its wide, banking turn back toward the west. "Captain, we're losing airspeed!" Tex shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of fighting the yoke. "We're falling out of the box! We can't keep up with the lead group!" This was the moment every bomber pilot feared more than the flak or the fire. In the brutal mathematics of the combat box, the formation was your only shield. Once you lagged behind, once you became a straggler, you were no longer a part of a fortress. You were a lone, wounded animal in a sky full of wolves. I jammed the 3 remaining throttles forward until the manifold pressure needles hovered in the red, pushing the engines to their absolute breaking point. The heavenly maiden groaned, her airframe shivering under the unnatural load. But the gap between us and the tail of the group ahead continued to grow. 10 yards. 50 yards. 100. "Miller, give me a heading for the coast! The shortest way out of this hell!" I barked into the interphone. "Captain, we can't take the short way," Miller's voice came back, sounding faint. "If we cut across the Ruhr, the flak will finish us. We have to stay on the flight path, but we're drifting south. The wind, it's pushing us right into the arms of the interceptor base at Abbeville." I looked out at the horizon. The German fighters, having refueled and rearmed on the ground while we were over the target, were climbing back up like a swarm of angry hornets. They ignored the main formation, which was still bristling with hundreds of defensive guns. Instead, they turned their collective attention toward us, the smoking, lagging silhouette of a lone B-17. "All gunners, listen up!" I yelled, my voice ringing in my own ears. "We're on our own. Look for the flashes. Don't waste your ammunition on long shots. Wait until you see the spinning hubs of their props. If we don't hold them off for the next hour, none of us are seeing England again." "Sullivan, status on Zeke," I added, remembering the blood on the floor. He's alive, Cap," Sullivan's voice came through, punctuated by the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of his waist gun. "I've got a tourniquet on his leg, but the morphine is frozen in the syrette. He's conscious, but he's screaming. The wind is blowing right through the hole in the tail. It's a meat locker back here." I felt a cold stone of guilt settle in my stomach. I was the captain. Their lives were tied to my hands on this wheel. I looked at Tex. His face was a mask of pale, sweat-streaked terror, his eyes wide as he watched the first pair of Messerschmitts peel off for a pass at our 6 o'clock. "They're coming in, Tex. Brace yourself." The first pass was a blur of silver and fire. A Messerschmitt 109 dived from the sun, its cannons flickering. The shells walked across our left wing, punching a row of jagged holes through the U in our squadron identification letter. I felt the hits through the floorboards, sharp, metallic raps that sounded like a giant hammering on the hull. "I got him! I got the bastard!" Zeke's voice suddenly crackled over the wire, a ragged, pain-filled cheer. I looked back just in time to see the German fighter erupt into a ball of orange flame. It tumbled past our tail, trailing a long, oily plume of black smoke. But there were 20 more behind him. We were 300 miles from the English Channel, flying at a reduced speed, with a wounded crew and a dying ship. Every mile felt like a marathon. every minute felt like a year. The sky was no longer a highway. It was a gauntlet of fire, and we were running it on one lung. "Keep her level, Tex," I whispered, my muscles burning from the effort of holding the lopsided plane steady. "Just keep her level. 1 mile at a time." The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the clouds. It was a beautiful sight, but all I could see was the black specks of the hunters closing in for the kill. We had hit the heart of the machine, but now the machine was coming to claim its debt. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly violet as the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows of our crippled fortress across the white floor of the cloud bank. We were falling further behind the main formation with every passing minute. The distant glint of the other 300 bombers looked like a shimmering silver ribbon pulling away toward safety, leaving the Heavenly Maiden alone in the darkening vastness of the German airspace. The silence in the cockpit, broken only by the ragged drone of our 3 remaining engines, was heavy with the realization that we were now bait. "Fighters, 6 o'clock low, coming up under the belly!" The ball turret gunner, a wiry kid named Joey, screamed over the interphone. I felt the ship shudder as Joey's twin 50s began to bark, the vibration traveling up through my seat and into my spine. The German pilots had smelled blood. They knew we were struggling to maintain altitude, and they were using our own blind spots against us. A pair of Messerschmitts rose out of the haze like predatory sharks, their cannons spitting white-hot shells that walked a line of fire across our belly. Clang, clank, shriek! The sound of metal tearing was high-pitched and agonizing. One shell punched through the radio room, shattering the equipment into a spray of vacuum tubes and copper wire. I heard a grunt of pain from Sparks, our radio operator, followed by the terrifying sound of rushing air. "Sparks is hit! It's his arm, Captain! It's bad!" Sullivan yelled from the waist. "Tex, take the wheel! Keep us level, no matter what!" I roared, unbuckling my harness. The cockpit was a cyclone of freezing air and floating debris. I scrambled back toward the radio room, my oxygen hose trailing behind me like a lifeline. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees below zero. Every breath felt like swallowing a mouthful of needles. I found Sparks slumped over his desk, his heated suit shredded, his blood already turning into dark, frozen rubies on the floorboards. I grabbed the first aid kit, my fingers clumsy and numb in my thick flight gloves. I didn't have time for finesse. I jammed a syringe of morphine into his thigh, praying it hadn't frozen solid, and wrapped a heavy bandage over the jagged ruin of his shoulder. He looked at me with eyes that were glazed with shock, his teeth chattering so hard I thought they would shatter. "Hold on, Sparks," I whispered, though he couldn't hear me over the roar of the wind. "Just hold on. We're almost to the water." As I crawled back to the cockpit, a massive explosion rocked the ship. A rocket, one of the new German air-to-air projectiles, had detonated 50 feet off our starboard wing. The concussion tossed the Heavenly Maiden nearly 90 degrees. I was thrown against the bulkhead, the air huffed out of my lungs, my vision swimming in a sea of red and black spots. "Captain, I can't hold her! The cables are frayed!" Tex was screaming, his boots dancing on the rudder pedals as he fought to keep the nose from dropping into a terminal dive. I hauled myself back into the left seat and grabbed the yoke. It felt limp, like a broken limb. We had lost half of our elevator control. The ship wanted to put her nose down and scream toward the earth. I planted my feet and pulled with everything I had, my muscles screaming in protest. "Miller, how much further to the coast?" 20 minutes, maybe 25, Miller shouted back. He was huddled in the nose, clutching a spare machine gun, his face masked by a layer of frost. "But we're losing height, Captain! We're down to 17,000 feet!" 17,000. We were dropping into the thick of the German coastal defenses. At this altitude, every light flak gun from Ostend to Calais would be able to reach out and touch us. And the fighters? They were lining up for another pass. I looked out the window and saw a Focke-Wulf pull up alongside us, not 500 feet away. The pilot was wearing a yellow flight jacket. He looked at me, his face obscured by his oxygen mask, and slowly tapped his temple with a gloved finger. It was a gesture of cold, professional respect. Or Perhaps he was just marking the spot where he intended to put his next burst. "All gunners, fire at will," I commanded. "If you see a cross, burn it." The Heavenly Maiden became a volcano of tracer fire. The interior of the ship was filled with the acrid, choking smoke of burnt cordite and the rhythmic, soul-crushing mechanical hammer of 10 machine guns. We were no longer a crew. We were a group of dying men in a silver box, screaming at the sky. Zeke was still firing from the tail, his voice a ragged, incoherent prayer over the interphone. Sullivan and Joey were alternating bursts, their barrels glowing a dull, angry red in the twilight. We were burning through our ammunition at a suicidal rate, but there was no other choice. If we didn't keep them at bay now, there would be no ammunition left to save. "Captain, number 2 is surging!" Tex yelled, pointing at the tachometer. The needle was jumping wildly. The engine that had been our workhorse was finally giving up. Its internal bearings, ironically, the very things we had traveled 300 miles to destroy, shredded by the strain. The engine coughed, a gout of black smoke erupted from the cowl, and the propeller slowed to a sickening, rhythmic thud. "2 engines," I whispered, the cold settling into my bones. "We're down to 2. We were falling out of the sky over occupied France, 1,000 miles from home, with 5 wounded men and a ship held together by little more than prayer and American rivets. The darkness was closing in, and the coast of England felt like it was on the far side of the moon. The loss of the second engine changed the very song of the Heavenly Maiden. The rhythmic, powerful thrum of the 4 right cyclones had been reduced to a ragged, asymmetrical cough. With both engines on the right wing dead or dying, the ship developed a perverse, heavy soul, wanting to drag its nose into a terminal spiral toward the French soil below. I had to stand on the left rudder pedal with my full weight, my thigh muscles trembling under the strain, just to keep the horizon level. "Throttles to the stops on 1 and 3, I commanded, my voice raspy from the dry oxygen. "Tex, help me with the trim. She's trying to dive." Together, we fought the control column. It felt like wrestling a dying giant. Every inch of altitude we lost was a minute of life stolen from us. We were drifting down through 15,000 feet, then 14, entering the soup of the evening haze. The golden hour had passed, leaving the sky a bruised charcoal gray, illuminated only by the rhythmic pale flashes of our own tracer fire and the terrifying incandescent streaks of German cannons. "Captain, the interphone is failing!" Sullivan's voice came through, buried in a sea of static. Zeke stopped firing! I think he's passed out from the cold, or he's out of ammo. I'm going back! I'm going—" The line went dead with a sharp electronic pop. We were losing the nerves of the ship. One by one, the connections that made us a crew were snapping. In the cockpit, the frost was thick on the inside of the glass, a white crystalline forest that I had to scrape away with my fingernails just to see the dim lights of the instrument panel. My feet were blocks of wood. I couldn't feel the rudders anymore, only the dull, aching pressure in my hips. "Look!" Tex shouted, pointing through the shattered nose. Ahead, through a gap in the lower clouds, a thin, shimmering line of silver appeared. It wasn't the sky. It was the English Channel. The sight of that water, cold and unforgiving as it was, felt like the gates of heaven. But between us and that silver line lay the coastal batteries of the Atlantic Wall. The Germans knew we were coming. They could track our slow, limping descent on their radar screens like a wounded bird trailing blood across a pond. "Flak! 12 o'clock! Low!" Miller screamed from below my feet. The coastal guns opened up with a ferocity that made the mid-Germany batteries look like a rehearsal. Because we were low, barely 10,000 feet now, the heavy 88mm shells were bursting with terrifying precision. The sky turned into a kaleidoscope of orange fire and jagged steel. A shell detonated so close to the cockpit that the concussion blew the flight lunch thermos off the pedestal, shattering it against the bulkhead. The smell of hot coffee and vegetable soup mingled with the acrid stench of cordite and scorched hydraulic fluid. "I can't hold her, Tom!" Tex yelled. using my first name for the first time in 2 years of flying together. "The elevator trim is gone! She's going nose down!" "Pull, Tex! Pull like you're hauling a plow in Texas!" We both grabbed the yoke, our chests heaving, our boots braced against the instrument panel for leverage. The Heavenly Maiden groaned, a deep structural protest of duralumin and steel. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose rose back toward the horizon. But we were bleeding speed. We were down to 130 miles per hour, barely above stalling speed. If we dropped any lower, the wings would simply stop biting the air and we would fall like a stone. "Fighters peeling away," Miller reported, his voice sounding oddly peaceful.
"They're hit! No, wait! They're running low on fuel! They're leaving us to the guns!"
I looked out and saw the last 2 Focke-Wulfs bank away toward their base at Pas de Calais. They had done their work. They had stripped us of our engines, our tail gunner, and our radio. Now they were leaving the final act to the gravity and the sea. "We're over the water," I whispered as the dark smudge of the French coastline slipped beneath our wings. "We're not clear yet," Tex muttered, staring at the fuel gauges. The needles for the 2 remaining tanks were bouncing off the empty pins. "We're flying on fumes and prayer, Captain, and I don't think we have enough of either to reach Norfolk." The Heavenly Maiden was vibrating with a new, rhythmic shudder, a death rattle that indicated the main spar was warped. Every gust of wind felt like it might snap the ship in 2. Behind us, in the waist and the tail, 5 wounded men were huddled in the dark, freezing and bleeding, trusting their lives to a pilot who could barely feel his own hands. "Miller, get up here," I called out. "I need every set of eyes on the horizon. Look for the searchlights of the coast. Look for anything that looks like England." We drifted out over the black void of the channel. The moon began to rise, casting a ghostly, pale light over the waves 4,000 feet below. We were a ghost ship, silent but for the erratic whistling of the wind through 1,000 bullet holes. We had survived the air trap and the heart of the machine, but now we faced the oldest enemy of all, the cold, dark silence of the end. The English Channel at night is not a body of water. It is a hungry, black lung that inhales the warmth of anything that touches it. From 3,000 feet, the waves looked like jagged teeth of obsidian, capped with the pale, sickly foam of the rising tide. The Heavenly Maiden was no longer flying. She was falling with style, a 60,000-pound glider of shredded duralumin held aloft by nothing more than the desperate, white-knuckled grip of 2 exhausted men and the lingering momentum of her dying engines. "Number 3 is surging again," Tex whispered. His voice was a dry rattle, stripped of its Texas drawl by hours of screaming over the wind. "She's throwing sparks, Tom. The internal bearings are cooking themselves. If she seizes, the drag will pull us right into the drink." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My jaw was locked in a frozen grimace, and my eyes were fixed on the horizon, searching for the faintest pinprick of light. The Black Thursday mission had begun in the golden mist of an English morning, but it was ending in a purgatory of gray shadows and the smell of ozone. We were down to 2,000 feet. The air was thicker here, warmer, but heavy with the salt of the sea, which only made the cockpit smell more like a wet grave. "Miller, get the flares ready," I croaked. "If we hit the coast, I want every color in the bag going up. We have wounded, we have no radio, and I don't think I can find the runway in the dark." "I'm on it, Captain," Miller's voice came from the hatch. He crawled up into the cockpit, his face a roadmap of soot and dried blood from the shattered nose. He looked 10 years older than he had at the 4 o'clock briefing. He slumped against the navigator's table, clutching a flare pistol like a holy relic. Suddenly, a rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoed through the floorboards. It wasn't flak. It was the number 3 engine finally giving up the ghost. A spectacular fountain of white-hot magnesium sparks erupted from the cowl, illuminating the cockpit in a hellish, flickering strobe light. The propeller shuddered, groaned, and then snapped its drive shaft with a sound like a cannon shot. The blades flew off into the darkness, narrowly missing our cockpit glass. "She's gone," Tex said, his hands falling limp from the throttles. "We're on one engine and 3,000 pounds of empty airframe." The Heavenly Maiden dipped her right wing, leaning toward the water like a weary drunk. I jammed the left rudder pedal down with both feet, my thighs burning with a white-hot agony that made me want to scream. We were at 1,000 feet. The whitecaps were clearly visible now, individual waves, cold and indifferent, waiting for us. "There! 10 o'clock!" Miller screamed, pointing a trembling finger. Through the haze, a long, sweeping finger of light cut through the dark. A searchlight. Then another. And another. It was the British coastal defense, the great searchlight belt of East Anglia. They were sweeping the sky for returning stragglers, looking for the ghosts of the 8th Air Force. "Fire the flares, Miller! Now!" Thwip, thwip, thwip. 3 streaks of light, red, and green, arced into the night sky. The international distress signal for urgent medical assistance required. Almost immediately, the searchlights stopped their rhythmic sweeping and converged on us. 4 massive beams of light locked onto the silver belly of the Heavenly Maiden, turning the cockpit from a dark tomb into a stage under a 1,000-watt spotlight. It was blinding, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. "They see us," Tex breathed, a single tear cutting a clean path through the soot on his cheek. "God, they actually see us." But seeing us wasn't the same as saving us. We were at 500 feet, and the engine on the left wing, our last spark of life, began to cough. It was starving for fuel. The tanks were dry. The Heavenly Maiden began to vibrate with a violent final shudder as the last drops of high-octane gasoline were sucked through the lines. "Flaps! Full flaps, Tex!" I roared. "We're going to have to belly her in. I can't risk the gear on this speed." The ship slowed, the nose pitching up as the giant flaps caught the air like a parachute. We were skimming the tops of the dunes now, the roar of the surf audible beneath us. Ahead lay the dark, flat expanse of an emergency landing strip, a crash strip, carved out of the marshes specifically for the broken birds of the daylight bombing campaign. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" I yelled into the dead interphone, hoping the boys in the back could hear me. I cut the master switch to prevent a fire. The world went silent, save for the whistling of the wind through the bullet holes. We hit the ground at 110 miles per hour. The sound was like a freight train derailment, a screeching, grinding roar of metal on dirt. The Heavenly Maiden plowed through the marshland, tossing up geysers of mud and peat. I was thrown forward against the harness, the straps cutting into my chest, my head snapping back as we hit a drainage ditch. And then, silence. The ship came to a rest at a slight tilt. For a long minute, no one moved. The only sound was the tink, tink, tink of cooling metal and the distant, lonely cry of a seagull. We were on the ground. We were in England. We were alive. The silence that followed the crash was more deafening than the roar of the engines had ever been. It was a thick, heavy vacuum, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of hydraulic fluid onto the scorched English mud. I sat in the pilot's seat, my hands still fused to the control wheel, my fingers locked in a skeletal grip. It took a physical effort of will to pry them loose, one by one. They felt like brittle twigs that might snap if I moved them too fast. "Tex," I whispered. My voice was a ghostly rasp, barely audible over the settling of the metal. Beside me, Tex slumped against his harness. He didn't move for a long, terrifying 10 seconds. Then he drew a jagged, shuddering breath and wiped a smear of oil from his forehead. He didn't look at me. He just stared out through the jagged remains of the cockpit glass at the green, wet grass of the marshland. "We're down, Tom," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "We're actually on the ground." We scrambled out of the cockpit, dropping through the open bomb bay onto the soft, forgiving earth. I fell to my knees, my legs refusing to support the weight of my flight gear. The smell of the damp earth was the most beautiful thing I had ever encountered. It smelled of life, of damp decay, of things that didn't explode or burn. The ground crews and ambulances from the emergency strip were already racing toward us, their headlights cutting through the coastal mist like the eyes of prehistoric beasts. But I didn't wait for them. I hauled myself up and ran toward the waist of the Heavenly Maiden. The fuselage was a sieve. From the outside, the silver skin was peeled back in jagged curls, revealing the skeletal ribs of the ship. I climbed through the waist door and stopped. The interior was a slaughterhouse. Sullivan was sitting on the floor, his back against the ammunition rack, holding a blood-soaked bandage to his side. He was staring at Zeke, who was still strapped into the tail turret. "Is he?" I couldn't finish the sentence. "He's breathing, Captain," Sullivan whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. "But he's gone. He hasn't said a word since we crossed the coast. He just kept his hands on the grips until the ammo ran out." We hauled them out, the living, the broken, and the silent. Sparks was unconscious but alive, his face as pale as the moon. Miller stood by the wing, clutching his navigation charts as if they were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. We watched in a daze as the medics loaded our crew into the ambulances, the red crosses on the side of the trucks flickering in the strobing lights of the rescue vehicles. 6 hours later, a transport truck dropped Tex, Miller, and me back at Thorpe Abbott's. The base was shrouded in a thick, sulphurous fog that muffled the sound of the wind. We walked toward the officers' mess hall, our flight boots heavy with the mud of the coast, our sheepskin jackets stained with oil and the copper scent of the day's toll. Inside, the mess hall was brightly lit, but it felt like a cathedral during a funeral. Usually, after a mission, the room was a riot of noise, men shouting, engines being mimicked with hand gestures, the clatter of tin trays. Tonight, there was only the low, somber murmur of a few dozen voices. I looked at the long wooden tables. Each squadron had its assigned section. At the table for our group, there were 60 seats. Only 12 men were sitting there. The rest of the table was empty. Not just unoccupied, empty in a way that felt like a physical weight in the room. There were half-eaten plates of cold stew where men had sat for breakfast, and unopened packs of Lucky Strikes. The silence was the sound of 60 men who were currently lying in the forests of Germany, or floating in the cold, gray reaches of the Channel, or sitting in a German stalag wondering how the world had turned so dark in a single afternoon. "Captain Whitaker," a voice said. I turned to see Colonel Thompson. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He held a clipboard, his eyes scanning the three of us. He didn't ask how the mission went. He already knew. The reconnaissance Spitfires had returned with the photos. The ball-bearing plants were ruins, but the 8th Air Force had been bled white to do it. "The Maiden?" he asked softly. "She's in a marsh near Mundesley, sir," I replied, standing as straight as my trembling legs would allow. "She won't fly again." "And the crew?" "5 in the hospital. Two didn't make the walk back from the planes." The colonel nodded slowly. He reached out and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You got them home, son. That's more than most did today." He walked away, leaving us standing in the center of the room. I looked back at the empty table. I thought of the air trap over the border, the wall of fire over the factories, and the yellow-nosed fighters that had hunted us like wolves. We had won the Battle of the Bearings, but as I looked at the vacant chairs of my friends, I wondered if the machine we were trying to break was actually us. I sat down at the end of the table and picked up a cold piece of bread. My hands were still shaking. I looked at Tex, and he looked at me, and in that moment, we both knew that the boys who had taken off at 4 o'clock that morning were never coming back. Only the soldiers remained. 400 miles, Miller whispered, staring into his coffee. 400 miles of coffin. Outside, the fog thickened, hiding the empty hardstands where the other B-17 Fortresses should have been parked. The Black Thursday was over, but the ghosts of Schweinfurt were just beginning their long, silent watch over the fields of England.